He had survived wars, buried friends, and learned how to live with silence. On Christmas Eve, a lonely veteran expected nothing but another quiet night, until a frightened alien woman arrived at his door with her children and nowhere left to run. Subscribe for powerful stories where humanity proves its strength through compassion, courage, and quiet heroism. The snow fell softly outside the small cabin, the kind of slow, patient snowfall that made the world feel paused rather than alive. It covered the pine trees in white and muted every sound, turning the forest into something distant and unreal. Inside, the cabin was warm, but empty in a way heat could never fix. The veteran sat alone at the wooden table, hands wrapped around a chipped mug that had long since stopped steaming. He had reheated the coffee twice already, more out of habit than desire. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second echoing in a room that hadn't heard laughter in years. Christmas Eve. He didn't decorate anymore. No lights, no tree, no music. Those things belonged to another life, one that had ended quietly when he came home from a war that never truly left him. He had learned to tolerate the silence. Some days, he even preferred it. Silence didn't ask questions. Silence didn't look at him with pity or gratitude or expectation. The cabin was far from the city, tucked deep into government-leased woodland where no one visited unless they were lost or desperate. He liked it that way. Isolation was simpler, predictable, safe. He rose from the table and moved to the window, watching snow collect along the porch railing. His reflection stared back faintly in the glass, older than his years, eyes sharper than they should have been, shoulders still carrying a soldier's tension despite retirement papers signed decades ago. The war had taken his youth. Peace had taken everything else. A soft chime cut through the stillness. He froze. The sound wasn't from inside the cabin. It came from the door. No one came here. His instincts snapped awake instantly, years of training overriding age and comfort. He moved without hesitation, crossing the room and reaching into the drawer beside the door. His hand closed around cold metal, familiar and reassuring. Another chime followed, gentler this time. Almost hesitant, he peered through the narrow window beside the door, scanning the porch and the tree line beyond. At first, he saw nothing but falling snow and darkness. Then movement. A figure stood just beyond the porch light, partially shielded from view. Smaller than a human, too thin. And behind her, shapes huddled close, barely visible beneath layers of mismatched clothing. Alien. His grip tightened, not in fear, but readiness. Earth wasn't unfamiliar with aliens anymore. Trade routes passed overhead daily. Embassies existed. News feeds were full of off-world politics and distant conflicts. But out here, on the edge of nowhere, an alien presence meant trouble. It meant someone running from something big enough to scare them into human territory. The chime sounded again, followed by a faint, strained voice. "Please, we are cold." The words were translated automatically through the cabin's external comm pickup, the accent warped slightly, but understandable. Female. Exhausted. He waited a long moment before responding, scanning for threats, listening for the telltale hum of engines or drones. Nothing. Just snow, wind, and a woman standing far too still. He cracked the door open just enough to see clearly. She stepped forward into the porch light, and the sight of her stopped him colder than the snow ever could. She was clearly alien, but not monstrous. Her skin shimmered faintly with a pale iridescence, dulled by dirt and frost. Her eyes were large, glassy with fear rather than menace. She held a small child against her chest, while two others clung to the back of her worn coat, peering out with wide, silent eyes. Children. They were shivering. "We do not wish harm," she said quickly, her voice breaking. "We were told some humans would help." He studied them carefully. No weapons. No devices beyond a small, cracked data unit hanging uselessly at her side. The children looked exhausted, their movements slow, their breaths shallow. Refugees. The words settled heavily in his chest. He had seen this before on other worlds, under different skies. Families displaced by forces far beyond them. Civilians caught between powers that never paid the price of their decisions. He exhaled slowly. "You picked a bad night," he said, his voice rough from disuse. Her shoulders tensed, and for a moment he thought she might turn and run, despite the cold. "We have no night left," she said quietly. The children whimpered softly, too tired even for fear. He opened the door wider. "Get inside," he said, "before you freeze." She hesitated, just long enough for him to see the calculation behind her eyes. The risk of trusting a stranger weighed against the certainty of dying outside. Then she stepped forward. Warm air spilled over them as they crossed the threshold. The children gasped softly, their bodies sagging with sudden relief. He closed the door behind them, locking it out of habit rather than necessity. The cabin felt smaller now, crowded, alive. He watched as the woman carefully guided the children toward the fireplace, keeping herself between them and him until they were settled. She didn't thank him. Not yet. Gratitude came later, when survival felt real. He set the weapon down on the counter, deliberately visible. "You can sit," he said. "I'll get blankets." As he moved to the storage chest, he felt something unfamiliar stirring beneath the layers of routine and isolation. A tension that wasn't combat-ready, but something closer to responsibility. He told himself it was temporary, just for the night, just because it was cold. But deep down, he already knew this wasn't just a visit. Christmas had a way of finding people who didn't believe in it anymore. And outside, far beyond the falling snow, forces much larger than this quiet cabin were already moving, unaware that their pursuit had just crossed paths with a human who had nothing left to lose and everything left to give. The children stopped shivering first. That was how he noticed the change. Not all at once, not dramatically, just the subtle way their shoulders loosened as warmth crept back into bones that had been cold for too long. The fire snapped softly in the hearth, throwing uneven light across the cabin walls and across faces that didn't quite trust the comfort yet. The woman remained standing. She positioned herself slightly between him and the children, even as exhaustion weighed on her posture. Her hands trembled, though she tried to hide it by clasping them together. He recognized that instinct. Protect first. Collapse later. "You can sit," he repeated, slower this time. She hesitated, then lowered herself carefully onto the edge of the couch, keeping the smallest child pressed to her side. The other two crouched near the fire, eyes fixed on the flames, as if they'd never seen something so openly alive. "They are safe?" she asked. "For now," he said. "No one else is coming here tonight." Her shoulders sagged at that. Not relief, permission to breathe. He handed her a thick wool blanket, then another, and another. She wrapped the children first, tucking the fabric around them with practiced efficiency before pulling a corner over herself. "Thank you," she said finally. The words sounded heavy, as if she'd carried them a long way. He nodded once and moved back toward the kitchen. He didn't like standing over people. Power dynamics mattered, even in kindness. "What's your name?" he asked, filling a kettle. She hesitated again. "Lyrian." He glanced over his shoulder. "I'm Thomas." The kettle began to hiss. The oldest child, a girl, judging by posture more than anything else, looked up at him. Her eyes were too large for her face, dark and reflective, tracking his every movement with cautious intensity. "She is wondering if this is a trick," Lyrian said quietly. "That's fair," Thomas replied. "I wonder the same thing sometimes." The girl blinked, then returned her gaze to the fire. Thomas poured hot water into mugs, dropped in tea bags he'd bought months ago and never opened, then set the tray down near the couch. He added a plate of bread and dried meat, watching closely for any sign of dietary incompatibility. Lyria noticed. "We can eat that." "Good." She tore small pieces first, offering them to the children before taking any herself. The youngest clutched the bread with both hands, devouring it silently. Hunger stripped away fear faster than warmth ever could. They ate like people who didn't know when the next meal would come. Thomas leaned against the counter, arms folded, eyes never fully leaving them. He cataloged details without meaning to: the patched clothing, the cheap thermal wraps meant for short exposure, the faint scorch marks along Lyrian's sleeve. Running, then. How long have you been on Earth? He asked. 3 days, she said. We landed outside permitted zones. Illegally. Yes. He nodded. You weren't aiming for me. No, she admitted. We were told to avoid cities. Humans there ask questions. That's not wrong. She watched him closely now. You are not afraid of us. He considered the question. I've been afraid worse. Her lips pressed together. The others said humans would either help us or turn us in. Others. She looked away. Those who didn't survive. Silence filled the cabin again, but it was different now. Not empty. Weighted. Thomas felt something tighten behind his ribs. He'd heard those words in too many languages, on too many worlds. Who's after you? He asked. Lyrian's eyes flicked toward the door, then the windows. They call themselves collectors. He stiffened slightly. Slavers. She nodded once. The children leaned closer to her instinctively, as if the word itself carried teeth. They destroyed our settlement, she continued. Took those who could work. Killed the rest to save fuel. Thomas closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, his voice was steady. And Earth. They believe humans will not interfere, she said. That your laws protect your borders more than strangers. He exhaled slowly. They're usually right. Her gaze sharpened. Usually? He met her eyes. I don't live by usually. She studied him, really studied him, as if trying to reconcile the quiet man in front of her with the decision she'd made standing in the snow. Why? She asked. Why help us? He didn't answer immediately. Because it's Christmas felt dishonest. Because I've seen what happens when no one opens the door sounded hollow. Because, he said finally, I know what it's like to be hunted. She didn't ask how. She didn't need to. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the trees. Snow slid off the roof in soft sheets. The cabin held. The middle child, barely more than a toddler, leaned sideways and fell asleep against the couch cushions. The oldest watched him, then glanced up at Thomas again. She wants to know, Lyrian said gently, if you are a soldier. Thomas paused. I was. The girl nodded once, as if that answered everything. Time passed in fragments after that. Thomas found spare clothes, larger than needed but warm. Lyrian cleaned the children's hands with careful thoroughness. The fire burned low, then high again. When the children finally slept, really slept, limbs loose, breaths deep, Lyrian allowed herself to sag back against the couch. You should rest, Thomas said. She shook her head. If I sleep, I may not wake. He understood that too. There's a bed in the back room, he said. You can lock the door. She hesitated. And you? I'll be here. Her eyes softened, just slightly. You are alone. Yes. That is unusual, she said carefully. For someone willing to help. People assume that, he replied. They're often wrong. She stood slowly, careful not to wake the children. At the doorway to the back room, she turned. If they find us, she said, they will not stop. I know, Thomas said. You could still send us away, she added. It would be safer. He met her gaze, unwavering. Not tonight. She inclined her head, not a bow, but something close. Then, whatever happens next, we face it together. After she closed the door, Thomas sat by the fire and stared into the flames. The quiet pressed in again, but it no longer felt empty. He reached under the floorboard beneath the rug and retrieved something he hadn't touched in years. Old tech. Military issue. Still functional. He powered it on. A soft green light blinked to life. Somewhere beyond the forest, engines whispered through the upper atmosphere. Careful, searching, patient. The collectors were thorough. But they had made one mistake. They had followed their prey to the door of a man who remembered exactly how to defend a perimeter, and exactly why some lines were worth holding. Christmas Eve had brought strangers into his home. Christmas Day might bring a fight. Thomas didn't sleep. He sat at the small table near the front window, lights dimmed, cabin sensors rerouted to manual display. Snow continued to fall, but now he saw patterns in it, interruptions, eddies where air shouldn't have moved the way it did. Something was out there. The green indicator on the old military unit pulsed steadily. Passive scan only. He didn't want to announce anything yet. Not to them. He checked the perimeter sensors he'd buried years ago, half forgotten, officially decommissioned, unofficially maintained. Most were quiet. One wasn't. A faint distortion blinked at the edge of the display. High altitude. Slow movement. Controlled. Thomas exhaled through his nose. Damn. Collectors didn't rush. They hunted the way accountants audited, methodically, relentlessly, convinced the numbers would eventually lead them to what they wanted. Behind him, the cabin creaked softly as it settled. Would expanding, contracting. Normal sounds. Comforting, if you let them be. He didn't. He rose and moved silently down the short hallway, stopping outside the back room. He listened first. 3 breathing patterns. 1 adult, shallow but steady. 2 children, deeper and uneven. Sleeping. Good. He returned to the table and pulled up the external feed again. The distortion resolved slightly, enough for his implants to flag it as cloak propulsion. Small craft. Probably a scout. Too early. They were faster than he'd hoped. He considered his options the way he'd been trained to: cold, sequential, unemotional. Cabin defenses existed, but they were meant to deter wildlife and trespassers, not professional slavers. Evacuation routes were limited. The snow would slow Lyrian and the children long before it slowed a drone. Running wasn't an option. Not tonight. The scout dipped lower, skimming the treetops beyond visual range. Sensors flickered as it probed for thermal signatures. Thomas dimmed the cabin's internal heat output, redirecting warmth inward and masking external bleed. A risky move. He didn't want the children cold again. He adjusted insulation parameters instead. Slower, but safer. The scout passed overhead once, twice, then veered off slightly. Not gone. Just narrowing the net. Thomas reached for his coat and slipped it on, then opened the cabinet beneath the stairs. The false panel slid aside smoothly, revealing equipment wrapped in oiled cloth. He unwrapped it carefully, laying each piece out with practiced familiarity. Compact rifle. Non-standard. Modified. He'd promised himself he wouldn't touch it again. Promises changed when children were involved. The door behind him creaked softly. He turned instantly. Lyrian stood there, eyes wide but clear, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She hadn't slept after all. "They are here," she said quietly. "Yes," he replied. "1 scout. Maybe more." Her jaw tightened. "Then they followed us faster than expected." He studied her. "You've dealt with them before." She nodded once. "We ran for months." He gestured to the chair. "Sit. We need to talk." She obeyed, but her eyes kept flicking toward the window. "They will test first," she said. "Signals. Probes. If no resistance, they land teams. And if there is resistance, they escalate." Thomas nodded. "Good." She looked at him sharply. "Good. It means they won't expect preparation," he said. "They rely on fear." She swallowed. "You are one human." "Still," he said, adjusting the rifle's power cell. "More than they planned for." A faint hum vibrated through the floorboards. Not sound, pressure. The scout tightening its scan. Lyrian's hands clenched in the blanket. "If they identify us, they will burn the structure to flush us out." "Not immediately," Thomas said. "They want assets intact." Her gaze sharpened. "Children are assets." "I know." Silence pressed in again, broken only by the low crackle of the fire. "You could still leave," she said. "Take your chances elsewhere." He shook his head. "They won't stop if you run. They'll just widen the search." "And if you stay?" she asked. He met her eyes. "Then they'll have to deal with me first." She studied him the way one predator studies another, recognizing something familiar. "You were not just a soldier," she said. "No," he agreed. "I was something worse." The scout signal spiked briefly, then stabilized. Thomas moved to the wall panel near the door and keyed in a sequence. Outside, the ground around the cabin shifted subtly as dormant systems came online. Not weapons. Measures. "Basement access?" Lyrian asked. "Under the pantry," he said. "Shielded. Old fallout shelter. Get the children there if I tell you to." "If. I'm hoping to misdirect first." She nodded once. Tell me what to do. He paused. If I fail, you run. No matter what you hear. Her voice was steady. And you? I'll make noise. The scout circled again, lower this time. Thomas stepped onto the porch. Cold bit immediately, sharp and unforgiving. Snow crunched softly beneath his boots as he moved just far enough from the cabin to present a clearer thermal outline. He powered up a small emitter and tossed it toward the tree line. The scout reacted instantly, vectoring toward the false signal. Good. He returned inside, just as Lyrian ushered the children toward the pantry, moving them with quiet urgency. The oldest looked back at him once, eyes wide but trusting. That trust settled heavily in his chest. The scout descended into the clearing, cloaking flickering as it struggled to reconcile conflicting readings. Thomas watched through the window, finger hovering near the trigger, but not squeezing yet. Too soon. A voice crackled through the cabin's external speakers, translated, flat, impersonal. Unregistered life forms detected. Surrender assets for processing. Thomas smiled humorlessly. No, he said aloud. The scout's cloak dropped fully. Sleek, angular, ugly in a way only something built for cruelty could be. Its sensors swept the cabin again. Thomas fired. The shot wasn't lethal, not yet. It was disruptive, a targeted burst that scrambled the scout's optics and sent it lurching sideways into the snow. It crashed hard, metal shrieking. Alarms wailed from the downed craft. Lyrian gasped from the pantry doorway. You've announced yourself. Yes, Thomas said, already moving. That was the point. He grabbed a pack from beneath the stairs and shoved it into her hands. If I say run, you take the tunnel south. Follow the markers. Don't stop. And you, she demanded. He met her gaze. I'll slow them down. The children clung to her now, fear fully awake. The youngest began to cry. The sound cut through Thomas sharper than any weapon. Outside, engines roared, plural this time. The collectors had been waiting closer than he'd hoped. He keyed the cabin defenses to full readiness, feeling the structure hum around him as systems aligned. This was no longer a quiet Christmas. This was a line drawn. He stepped back to the window, rifle steady, breath calm. They wanted assets. They had come to the wrong door. Because the one thing the collectors didn't account for, never did, was what happened when prey stopped running, turned around, and decided that this was where it stood. And that sometimes the most dangerous human in the galaxy was the one who had already lost everything worth fearing. The first dropship broke through the cloud cover like a blade. It descended without haste, engines humming at a pitch meant to intimidate rather than hurry. Collectors liked to arrive as if resistance was already futile. They wanted fear to do the work for them. Thomas adjusted his stance and steadied the rifle against the window frame. His breath slowed, muscle memory taking over as naturally as blinking. The man who had once commanded squads in hostile territory was awake now, layered beneath years of quiet. Outside, the downed scout sparked and smoked in the snow, its alarms still shrieking. A second craft circled overhead, scanning aggressively, its beams slicing through the trees. They are landing, Lyrian whispered from behind him. I know, Thomas said. Stay ready. The dropship touched down at the edge of the clearing, compressing snow into glassy sheets beneath its mass. The ramp lowered, and 3 figures emerged, tall, armored, their silhouettes sharp against the floodlights they carried. Collectors. Their armor was utilitarian, scarred, built for intimidation rather than beauty. Weapons rested casually in their hands, confidence radiating from every movement. They spread out, flanking instinctively, trained for resistance they didn't truly believe they'd encounter. Thomas tracked them calmly. One raised a device and spoke again through the external speakers. Human structure. You are harboring stolen assets. Compliance will result in non-lethal resolution. Thomas leaned closer to the window. You crashed one of your scouts, he said evenly. That was your warning. The collector paused. That wasn't in their script. Identify yourself, the voice demanded. Someone who knows what you do to families, Thomas replied. And someone who isn't giving you anything. A beat of silence. Then laughter. Harsh, synthetic, amplified. You are one aging human. Your resistance changes nothing. Thomas fired again. This shot took out the floodlight nearest the dropship, plunging half the clearing into shadow. The sudden darkness forced the collectors to readjust, their formation tightening reflexively. They hadn't expected precision. The second shot hit the ground in front of the lead collector, detonating into a concussive burst that sent him sprawling backward. Non-lethal, but disorienting. Thomas wasn't trying to win yet. He was trying to buy time. "Basement," he called softly over his shoulder. "Now." Lyrian didn't argue. She scooped the youngest child into her arms, ushered the others down the pantry steps, and sealed the hidden door behind them. The cabin systems registered the closure and automatically rerouted power to the shelter shields. Good. Outside, the collectors recovered quickly. Two took cover behind the dropship's landing struts, while the third advanced cautiously, weapon raised. They were learning. Thomas shifted positions, moving away from the window before a return shot could shatter it. Energy bolts scorched the cabin's exterior, melting snow and charring wood, but failing to penetrate the reinforced shell beneath. "Escalation authorized," the collector voice announced. The ground trembled as the second craft descended lower, engines whining as it prepared to deploy drones. Thomas grimaced. That shortened the timeline. He activated the perimeter field. The snow around the cabin shimmered faintly as buried emitters surged to life. The collectors advanced and slammed into invisible resistance. One was thrown backward hard enough to leave a furrow in the snow. "What is this?" one shouted. "An old human habit," Thomas muttered. Digging in. Drones launched from the hovering craft, small and fast, swarming toward the cabin like metallic insects. Thomas dropped to one knee and fired in controlled bursts, each shot precise, each impact disabling rather than destroying. He counted breaths between shots. 1, 2, adjust, fire. The years fell away. A drone slipped through, skimming the porch roof and detonating against the cabin wall. The structure shuddered. Inside, something crashed to the floor. Thomas ignored it. A warning flashed on his display, external power draw spiking. The collectors were trying to overwhelm the perimeter field. He couldn't hold them forever. The snow behind the dropship began to glow as another team deployed, cutting a wide arc through the trees. They were adapting, flanking the way he'd known they would. Thomas backed toward the hallway, firing as he moved, drawing their attention, keeping them focused on him rather than the shelter beneath their feet. A bolt grazed his shoulder, searing through fabric and skin. He grunted, but didn't slow. Pain was information. He filed it away. "Human," the collector voice called again, closer now. "Your resistance is inefficient. You will be subdued." Thomas ducked into the kitchen and slammed a control panel. The cabin's internal lights flickered, then went dark. Emergency illumination kicked in, casting the room in deep red shadows. Collectors relied on optics. Humans learned to fight blind. He moved silently through the darkness, repositioning as the collectors breached the porch. Metal boots thudded against wood. Weapons hummed. Thomas waited. The first collector stepped inside. Thomas struck. The fight was brief, brutal, and quiet. A stun pulse to the joints, a hard blow to the helmet, a disarmed weapon skidding across the floor. The collector collapsed unconscious. Thomas didn't linger. More were coming. He retreated toward the back of the cabin, drawing them deeper, away from the pantry, away from the children hidden beneath the floor. Outside, engines roared again, louder this time. Heavy support inbound. This was getting bigger than a cabin in the woods. Thomas keyed his implant and sent a burst transmission on an old frequency he hadn't used in years. Encrypted. Short range. Desperate. If anyone was listening, they'd understand what it meant. Inside the shelter, Lyrian held the children close as the ground shook above them. She could hear muffled impacts, the crackle of energy weapons, the deep, steady rhythm of Thomas moving through his home like it was a battlefield. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer she wasn't sure anyone still listened to. Above them, Thomas made a stand. The collectors pushed harder now, anger replacing confidence. They hadn't expected resistance. They certainly hadn't expected skill. They were about to learn something else humans never advertised. That when cornered, when protecting those who couldn't fight back, humans didn't negotiate. They endured. They adapted. And sometimes they won not by being stronger, but by refusing to move when everything else said they should. The cabin was no longer a home. It was a defensive position. Smoke hung low near the ceiling, thin and acrid, curling around exposed beams where collector fire had scorched the wood. One wall glowed faintly where an energy bolt had bitten deep and failed to finish the job. Snow drifted through a shattered window, melting as it touched the overheated floor. Thomas moved through it all with deliberate calm. He could hear the collectors now, boots scraping, armor plates clicking softly as they coordinated in short, clipped bursts of untranslated speech. They were inside his perimeter, adapting faster than before. That worried him more than their numbers. He checked the charge on his rifle. 34%. Enough if he was careful. The emergency lights flickered again. Power fluctuation. They were draining the perimeter field harder now, forcing the old systems to work beyond design limits. The hum beneath his feet grew uneven. Time was thinning. Thomas ducked into the hallway just as a bolt tore through the space where his head had been a heartbeat earlier. He rolled, came up behind the half-collapsed bookcase, and fired twice. One collector dropped, armor spasming as the stun pulse overwhelmed its nervous system. The other retreated, shouting something sharp and angry. They were no longer confident. They were annoyed. Human, the external voice boomed again, distorted by interference. You are obstructing lawful reclamation. Continued resistance will result in structural annihilation. Thomas pressed his shoulder against the wall, breathing slow. You should have left when you had the chance. He keyed a switch on his wrist. Outside, one of the buried emitters overloaded intentionally, releasing a surge that sent a rippling shockwave through the snowfield. Two collectors were thrown off their feet, armor clanging as they hit the ground hard. He didn't smile. This wasn't about winning. It was about delaying. A warning flashed across his display. Shelter shields at maximum load. Good. That meant Lyrian and the children were still protected. He pulled back into the kitchen and dropped a compact charge near the doorway. Not lethal. Disruptive. He retreated down the hallway as boots thundered closer. The charge detonated with a sharp concussive crack. The cabin shook violently, dust raining down from the ceiling. A collector slammed into the far wall, stunned long enough for Thomas to strip its weapon and toss it aside. 2 minutes, he muttered to himself. Just 2. A new sound cut through the chaos. Heavier engines, lower frequency. Thomas froze. That wasn't collector tech. The noise came from above, not the clearing. Fast. Purposeful. He glanced at his display and saw a new contact resolve through the interference. Larger. Military grade. Terran. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The encrypted burst he'd sent earlier hadn't vanished into the void after all. Outside, the collectors noticed it too. Their movements shifted from aggressive advance to sudden urgency. Orders barked. Formations tightened. They were being hunted now. The Terran dropship screamed through the cloud cover like a meteor, atmospheric wash flattening the trees as it descended hard and fast. Floodlights ignited, cutting through smoke and snowfall, illuminating the clearing in stark white. A voice boomed across all channels, human, calm, and unmistakably professional. This is unified Terran defense. Unidentified off-world vessels. Power down immediately. The collectors didn't hesitate. They fired. Energy lanced upward, splashing harmlessly against reinforced Terran shielding. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Precision fire disabled one collector craft mid-hover, sending it spiraling into the trees in a storm of sparks and shattered branches. Thomas slumped briefly against the counter as the fight shifted outside, his legs finally remembering their age. He forced himself upright. Not done yet. The front wall detonated inward as a collector. Desperate now, breached through in a last attempt to see something, anything, before extraction became impossible. Thomas met it head-on. The struggle was brutal and close. Armor slammed into flesh. Metal scraped bone. Thomas felt something crack in his ribs, but didn't stop moving. He drove the rifle's stock into the collector's visor, then again, until the armor went slack. The collector collapsed at his feet. Silence followed. Not immediate. There were still distant blasts shouting commands, the thunder of Terran boots hitting snow. But inside the cabin, the fight was over. Thomas stood there, chest heaving, blood trickling from a cut above his eye, surrounded by wreckage and smoke. He keyed the shelter release. "Clear," he said hoarsely. The pantry door opened slowly. Lyrian emerged first, eyes wide, scanning the devastation with a sharp, practiced gaze. When she saw Thomas still standing, something in her expression loosened. The children followed, clinging to her coat. The youngest stared at the unconscious collector on the floor and pressed his face into her side. "They're gone," she asked. "They're leaving," Thomas said. "For now." Outside, Terran soldiers secured the clearing, weapons trained on the remaining collector craft as it fled into the clouds. Medics followed, moving fast and efficiently. A young officer stepped into the cabin, helmet tucked under one arm. He stopped short when he took the scene, then straightened. "Sir," he said to Thomas, "we received your signal. Took longer than we'd like." Thomas nodded. "You got here." The officer's gaze flicked to Lyrian and the children. "Refugees?" "Yes," Thomas said simply. The officer exhaled. "Figures. Christmas always gets weird assignments." One of the medics approached Thomas. "You're injured." "I've been worse." She didn't argue, already scanning him. Lyrian stepped closer, her voice low. "You called them." "I had an old number," Thomas said. "Didn't think it still worked." She looked at him with something like awe. "You stood alone against them." "No," he said. "I stood until help arrived." Outside, snow continued to fall, settling over scorched earth and broken metal alike. The cabin, battered but standing, steamed gently in the cold night air. Thomas watched Terran soldiers move with quiet competence, securing the area, checking sensors, doing what humans did best when they decided to care. Lyrian's children watched too, eyes wide, fear slowly giving way to something else. Wonder. Safety. A Terran officer approached Lyrian carefully. "Ma'am, you and your children are under Terran protection now." Lyrian swallowed. "We are safe." "Yes," the officer said. "You are." She closed her eyes, just for a second, and let herself believe it. Thomas sank into a chair, exhaustion finally claiming its due. His body ached in ways he'd forgotten it could. But beneath the pain was something warmer. Purpose. The war he'd left behind had found him again, but this time he hadn't fought for orders or flags. He'd fought for a woman and her children on Christmas Eve. Outside, the last collector ship vanished into the clouds, engines burning hard. They would remember this place. They would remember this human. And the galaxy would learn, slowly but inevitably, the same lesson it always did. That even when humanity seemed quiet, tired, or alone, old soldiers never truly stopped standing the line. Morning came slowly, as if the world itself needed time to recover. The snow had stopped some time before dawn, leaving the forest wrapped in a heavy, silent white. Smoke from the ruined collector craft drifted thinly upward, dissolving into the pale winter sky. The clearing around the cabin was crowded now, with Terran vehicles, portable lights, and uniformed figures moving with disciplined efficiency. Thomas sat on the edge of the porch steps, a thermal blanket draped around his shoulders, a medic kneeling in front of him with practiced patience. "You're lucky," she said, sealing a wrap around his ribs. "Another inch, and one of those bolts would have collapsed a lung." "Figures," he replied. "I've always been bad at quitting." She snorted softly and moved on. Inside the cabin, Lyrian watched through the open doorway. The children sat at the table, mugs of warm nutrient broth clutched in small hands, their eyes following every Terran soldier who passed by. Fear lingered in them, but it no longer owned them. They were alive. That was enough for now. A senior Terran officer approached Thomas, boots crunching softly in the snow. His uniform was immaculate despite the chaos. his expression calm but curious. Thomas Hale, the officer said. Former Expeditionary Defense Force. Thomas looked up. Haven't heard that name in a while. Records don't forget, the officer replied. Even when people try. He glanced toward the cabin. You housed 3 off-world refugees without authorization. Yes. You engaged armed slavers. Yes. You triggered an emergency beacon on a deprecated military channel. Thomas shrugged carefully. Still worked. The officer studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. Good thing it did. He turned slightly as another soldier approached and whispered something into his ear. The officer listened, then sighed. The collectors jumped out system. No pursuit authorized past the boundary. They'll be back, Thomas said. Eventually, the officer agreed. But not here. Not for a while. Thomas watched Lyrian through the doorway. She was helping the youngest sip carefully, murmuring softly in her own language. The sound carried a calm he hadn't heard in his home before. What happens to them? Thomas asked. The officer followed his gaze. They'll be processed as asylum seekers. Temporary housing. Medical checks. Relocation once status is confirmed. Thomas nodded. Good. There's more, the officer said. Collectors operating this close to Earth will draw attention. Political attention. Thomas's mouth tightened. Meaning this won't stay small, the officer said. Your actions may have saved 3 lives, but they also poke something ugly. Thomas looked back at the snow-covered trees. Then maybe it needed poking. The officer almost smiled. Inside, Lyrian stepped out onto the porch, wrapping her coat tighter against the cold. She stood beside Thomas, careful not to touch him without permission. They say we will be taken to the city, she said. Somewhere safe. That's the idea, he replied. She hesitated. And you? I'll stay, he said. This place still needs cleaning. She looked at the cabin, burn marks, shattered windows, snow tracked across the floor. Then she looked at him. You did not have to do this, she said quietly. I know. You could have closed the door. Yes. Why didn't you? Thomas thought of the silence before she arrived, of the way Christmas had felt like an empty date on a calendar rather than a night. Because someone once opened a door for me, he said. Long ago. She nodded slowly. Then I will teach my children that. The oldest child approached cautiously, holding something in her hands. She stopped in front of Thomas and held it out, a small, crude carving made from a scrap of wood, shaped vaguely like the cabin. She made it while you were fighting, Lyrian said softly. Thomas stared at it, then carefully took it, his fingers suddenly unsteady. Thank you, he said. The child nodded solemnly, as if completing an important duty. A transport vehicle hummed to life nearby. Soldiers began signaling, preparing to move out. Lyrian turned to Thomas, her expression torn between relief and something deeper. We will not forget this night. Good, he said. But don't let it define you. She considered that. Humans are strange, she said finally. You fight like you expect loss, but you help like you expect hope. Thomas smiled faintly. That's about right. She reached out then and clasped his hand briefly, carefully avoiding his injuries. The gesture was light, but it carried weight. Wherever we go, she said, we will remember the human who stood when it mattered. Then she stepped away, guiding her children toward the transport. Thomas watched them go until the doors closed and the vehicle lifted into the sky, vanishing beyond the tree-line. The clearing grew quiet again. Not empty. Different. The officer returned. You could have left with them, you know. Plenty of room on the transport. Thomas shook his head. This is my place. The officer nodded. If you ever change your mind, Earth could use people like you. Earth always could, Thomas said. When the last Terran vehicle departed, the forest settled back into itself. Snow reflected the morning light, hiding scars beneath its brightness. Thomas stood slowly and turned back toward the cabin. It would take weeks to repair. Months, maybe. But for the first time in years, the work didn't feel pointless. Christmas had come and gone. It hadn't brought peace or closure, but it had brought something else. Proof that even after the fighting stopped, after the world moved on, after a person thought they had nothing left to give. Humanity still showed itself in what came next. In shelter. In choice. In standing up the morning after and deciding that kindness was still worth the effort. The news reached the wider world faster than Thomas expected. By midday, low-orbit satellites had adjusted their focus. By evening, analysts were arguing over blurred footage of a cabin in the woods, scorched snow, and the unmistakable silhouette of a collector scout burning on re-entry. By nightfall, the story had crossed borders, then species. Thomas didn't see any of it. He was busy repairing a window. The temporary polymer sheet snapped into place with a hiss as it sealed against the cold. He tested the edges, satisfied, then stepped back and looked at the cabin. It was rough, scarred, but still standing. So was he. A soft hum announced an incoming message on the old console near the fireplace. He paused, frowning. That system hadn't been linked to public networks in years. He crossed the room and activated it. The projection resolved into a human woman in a dark uniform, older than most officers. Her expression composed but alert. "Mr. Hale," she said. "My name is Director Anwin Ross, Unified Terran Diplomatic Security." Thomas sighed. "That sounds expensive." Her lips twitched. "So is what you caused." "I didn't cause it," he said. "They came to my door." "And you answered," she replied. "That's the part everyone's discussing." She gestured, and the projection shifted to a series of data feeds, intercepted chatter, emergency alerts, collector traffic rerouting away from Terran space. "Slaver syndicates are withdrawing from nearby sectors," Ross continued. "They don't like unpredictability or publicity." Thomas studied the feeds. "Good. There's more," she said. "Several non-aligned species have filed formal notices of intent to revise their human contact policies." He looked up. "Because of one fight?" "Because of one choice," she corrected. "You didn't escalate. You didn't execute. You defended civilians on your own soil." She held his gaze. "That matters." Thomas leaned against the counter. "I didn't do it to make a statement." "I know," Ross said. "That's why it worked." She let the projection shift again, this time to a quieter image. Lyrian and her children, seated in a clean, sunlit medical bay. The youngest slept in her arms. The others watched something on a wall display, laughter tentative but real. "They're safe," Ross said. "Asylum granted. Relocation pending." Thomas felt something unclench in his chest. "Thank you." "They asked me to pass along a message," Ross added. Lyrian's face filled the projection. Her posture was steadier now, her eyes clearer. "You told me not to let that night define us," she said. "But it will guide us. My children now believe humans are not just powerful, but kind. That belief will shape who they become." The message ended. Thomas stared at the darkened console for a long moment. Ross watched him carefully. "You understand the implications." "Someone always does," he said. "Collectors won't forget," she said. "Neither will the people you inspired." "Inspired is a dangerous word," Thomas replied. "People start expecting things." Ross nodded. "That's why I'm not offering you a medal." "Good. I'm offering you a choice." He raised an eyebrow. "There are other Lyrians out there," Ross said. "Other cabins. Other doors. You've reminded the galaxy that humans don't always respond with fleets. Sometimes we respond with shelter." "And sometimes with guns," Thomas said. "Only when necessary," she replied. "Which is exactly the balance we've been trying to explain for decades." He considered that. "What do you want from me?" "Nothing," Ross said. "Officially." "Unofficially?" She smiled slightly. "Stay where you are. Be who you are. Let the story travel on its own." The projection faded. The cabin fell quiet again, but it was a different quiet now, alive with distant motion. Somewhere, beyond the trees, conversations were changing, assumptions shifting. Thomas stepped outside and breathed in the cold air. The forest stretched out before him, untouched, patient. He knelt and brushed snow from the scorched earth where the collector's craft had burned. Beneath it, green shoots already pressed upward, stubborn and unafraid. Life went on. That night As stars brightened overhead, Thomas lit a single lantern on the porch. Not for decoration, for visibility. A signal, if anyone was watching. The galaxy was vast, cruel in places, but it watched patterns closely. And now it had seen this one. A human veteran. A closed door opened. A line held. Not by conquest. By choice. The lantern burned steadily through the night. Thomas watched it from his chair by the window, the soft glow reflecting off fresh snow and the repaired glass. He hadn't lit it for tradition or memory or even hope. He lit it because light, once offered, carried responsibility. Morning. No engines. No alarms. No footsteps but his own. He brewed coffee again, this time drinking it while it was hot. The cabin smelled faintly of smoke and pine, and something else he hadn't felt in years. Continuity. Not peace, exactly, but forward motion. He moved slowly now, body reminding him of the price he paid. The medics had warned him to rest. He ignored that advice with the quiet confidence of someone who knew his limits better than charts ever could. Outside, he repaired what needed repairing. Boards replaced. Burn marks sanded down. A door reinforced where collectors had nearly breached. He worked without hurry, letting the rhythm settle him. Near noon, his console chimed again. This time, it wasn't an official channel. It was public. A short news clip played automatically. A still image of his cabin. The burned clearing. The headline scrolling beneath it. Human veteran defies slavers. Alien family granted asylum. Thomas shut it off. He didn't need the rest. By afternoon, messages began arriving on open civilian vans. Not addressed to him directly, not at first. Stories. Questions. Coordinates passed quietly between freighters and settlements. If a human did this once, would others? Are there more places like this? Thomas felt the weight of it settle in his chest. Not pride. Expectation. At dusk, a vehicle approached the cabin, slow, careful, unarmed. Thomas watched from the porch, hand resting lightly on the railing, not reaching for anything else. The vehicle stopped well short of the perimeter. A human woman stepped out. Civilian. Mid-aged. Nervous but determined. She raised her hands slightly. I heard about you. Thomas waited. They said you helped an alien family, she continued. I run a supply route. Off books. There are others. Not just aliens. People hiding. Running. She swallowed. I don't have weapons. I don't want trouble. Thomas studied her face, the way he'd studied Lyrian's the night she arrived. Fear. Resolve. A decision already made. What do you want? He asked. A place to bring them, she said. Not forever. Just somewhere they won't be hunted. Thomas looked at the lantern, still hanging by the door. He thought of Lyrian's children sleeping safely for the first time. Of the way the oldest had looked at him. Not as a soldier, not as a threat, but as something solid. I'm not a shelter, he said. I know, the woman replied. You're a door. The wind moved through the trees, soft and patient. Thomas nodded once. You can bring them here. One group at a time. Relief flooded her face. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, he said. Rules are simple. No weapons inside. No lies. Everyone helps. She smiled shakily. That sounds fair. As she left, Thomas stood alone again on the porch. The snow reflected the fading light, turning the forest gold for a moment before night reclaimed it. He lit the lantern again. Not because it was Christmas anymore. Because Christmas, he understood now, had never been about a date. It was about the choice to open a door. Far above Earth, ships adjusted their routes. Slavers marked new exclusion zones. Diplomatic files were rewritten, quietly acknowledging a truth no doctrine liked to admit. Humans were dangerous. Not because they conquered. Not because they dominated. But because when faced with cruelty, some of them chose kindness, and then defended it with everything they had left. Thomas sat back down at the table that night. Alone but not empty. Outside, the lantern burned. And somewhere in the galaxy, someone cold and desperate would see a light they hadn't expected, and learn the same lesson Lyrian had learned on Christmas Eve. that humanity wasn't defined by its wars. It was defined by what it chose to protect after the fighting stopped. And sometimes, the strongest weapon a human ever carried was an open door.